All right. Well, it's 11 o'clock and welcome to Stormwater Awareness Week. We're so glad you could join us. And so we hope that you can take part in lots of the workshops during the week. It's all about free stormwater education this week. And we have all sorts of workshops available for municipalities, for industrial, for construction, and for anyone in the stormwater industry. So we're glad you could join us today. I will be interviewing Brandon Roosenboom, who is the writer of the new construction general permit. And that is a hot topic, obviously, by the number of folks joining us this morning. And so Brandon works for the State Water Resources Control Board. He is the lead of the construction general permit division, and he will be telling us a little bit about this new permit that has just been adopted this month. So before we go further, I wanted to just also give a little disclaimer here. So we're glad Brandon can join us, but this is not an official water board workshop. This is just educational, informational. And so this presentation was given as information, is not comprehensive. The views expressed in this presentation are views of the presenters and do not necessarily reflect the views or policies of the State Water Resources Control Board. The State Water Board does not guarantee the accuracy of the information included in this presentation, accepts no responsibility for any consequences of its use. Terminology used may not necessarily be consistent with the permit, although we'll try to keep it consistent. For specific references in the permit, SIC codes, or anything about the permit, it's always best to contact the water board, and you can do that through the SMARTS help desk. And we'll be providing some contact information here in a moment for Brandon. So we just wanted to get that disclaimer out there first for you all. All right, so Brandon, well, welcome to Stormwater Awareness Week.
Thanks, John. I'm happy to be here.
All right, well, there's a lot to talk about, and this permit just went through the board hearing this month, September 8th. So catch us up to speed. Where are we in the permitting process?
Okay, that's correct. We went to the adoption meeting on September 8th, 2022, and the permit was adopted by the board members present. So unanimously by the board members present, and there was only 4 at the time. And so that means that we're kind of in the stage of the permit where before the effective date. The effective date is planned for September 1st, 2023, so roughly a year or so after it was adopted. And that means we're at the stage of the permit process that I like to call pre-implementation. And that kind of means it's the period where regulators and the regulated community have a chance to adapt to the new requirements.
And it's going to take some adapting for sure. There are some areas that didn't change a whole lot, but there are other areas that changed significantly, and we're going to be highlighting some of those this morning. So this adaptation period, I understand that we folks that are under the permit coverage right now, under the 2009 order, or what we might call the old permit, if they have an effective WDID number, they're going to stay under this for how long?
So for under the current permit, the 2022 permit contains a provision allowing existing dischargers to have what we call a regulatory transition period. And that regulatory transition period means that existing dischargers with their current WDIDs under the 2009 permit are allowed to continue coverage under the 2009 permit for up to 2 years after the effective date of the 2022 permit. So essentially they'll have until August 31st, 2025 to complete their projects. Otherwise, they will have to enroll by September 1st, 2025 in the 2022 permit.
Okay. So will they need to file a new notice of intent, or do they need to do anything different?
So their existing permits, their existing WDIDs under 2009 permit will be administratively terminated. And then the discharger would have to refile a notice of intent with their updated documents that are compliant with the new requirements, and also certify that they are seeking to continue coverage under the construction general permit for an existing project.
But that's at or before September 1st, 2025, right?
Yes, so at or before. If the discharger was continuing coverage after their 2009 permit was terminated administratively, they would technically be out of compliance with, or they wouldn't have a permit that is regulating them, and therefore they would be out of compliance.
Okay, so but between now and next September 1, they don't really need to do anything, right? They are just going to be under the permit as they have been all along.
That is correct. And so once September 1st rolls around, any new project that's filed after that date would have to file under the 2022 permit. So folks that are still planning on submitting before September 1st, they'll have coverage under the 2009 permit.
Okay. Now, I noticed that there were several last minute changes. Well, maybe they weren't exactly last minute, but recent changes. There were 2 change sheets that were released in the weeks leading up to the board hearing. Could you tell us some of what was on there? Maybe why the changes were needed, and some of the changes that were made in the weeks leading up to the board hearing?
Okay. Well, a lot of the revisions identified in the change sheet, and particularly the first change sheet, were to increase clarity and correct some of the erroneous section references where when staff were revising the permit documents, we may have changed a few of the sections, and that inadvertently kind of changed the references in the permit.
Just cleaning up some things.
However, there were a lot of significant changes that were also included as part of the change sheets, from being how or what post-construction plans and calculations are expected when dischargers are applying for permit coverage, as well as removing any specific instances where fees are listed, and just tying that back and referring back to the water board's fee policy, because it kind of puts us in a sticky spot if we say the fee is going to be one thing in the permit, but then for the fee policy, it has to change. So we made that clarification there. We also made some clarifications for programmatic permitting, which affects linear utility and underground, or linear underground and overhead projects.
And when you say programmatic permitting, tell us a little bit more about that. What does that involve?
Yeah, so programmatic permitting is it's a type of permitting where multiple sites that are non-contiguous are able to be covered under a single WDID, but they'll have their own reference number that's called an LCAN, or a linear construction activity notification. And so the basis for this is a lot of these utility companies are working on projects that have a very standard procedure of what they do throughout the entire region. And so they'll be able to, if their projects are the same scope of activities, they'll be deploying the same kinds of BMPs, and they'll have the same kind of people, staff or personnel that are trained to those specific kinds of activities and best management practices. And so we're allowing them to essentially cover multiple sites under one permit per region.
Yeah, it just makes it a little more streamlined for them, and
yes,
not as laborious for them. Okay, good. Good.
Other things that were in the change sheet include the revision of the end of a qualifying precipitation event, and how that affects and triggers the post-storm inspections. And then there's also some changes pertaining to the total suspended solids numeric effluent limitation surrogate for certain TMDLs that address metals, organochlorine pesticides, and PCBs. And we can talk about those later in today's interview.
Okay, so as you mentioned, it's going to be a process to really roll this out. Now, I imagine it's going to take a lot to get everybody on board with the new permit requirements, learning those new requirements. And there's different entities that are going to be involved in that, such as the contractors. You have the QSPs and the QSDs, and you have the people that train them, the trainers of records. So maybe could you speak to what the process or what you think the process is going to look like? I understand it's not completely spelled out yet, but how is it going to impact SMARTS? What kind of process is SMARTS going to have to go through to get caught up to this permit? And then also the QSP, QSD training program, what will that look like?
Okay. Yeah, so first of all, that regulatory transition period does kind of complicate things for both SMARTS and our stormwater professionals. So why don't we talk about SMARTS first? The dischargers that are continuing coverage under the 2009 permit will likely continue to use the current SMARTS interface. However, dischargers using or regulated under the 2022 CGP will likely be using a redesigned interface. And staff, myself included, as well as Stormwater Help Desk and some at the regional water boards right now, are currently working on redesigning that interface and combing through the permit requirements and kind of determining what information that we really need to collect and just hopefully trying to streamline the use of SMARTS for our dischargers. So our focus is to only ask for the data we really need to assess compliance. There is currently a beta version of SMARTS or the new SMARTS menu that is available for users to comment on right now. And that's located on the SMARTS webpage. And our intent is that the beta menu screens will make it easier to apply for permit coverage, change your permit information or your status of your site, and as well as adding users to your profile and being able to access information just from a public point of view.
Yeah, I've already checked that beta menu out. It is much easier to navigate. So thank you.
I'm glad you think that.
It saves a lot of time.
Yeah, exactly. That's the whole point of our work. We're trying to make this a little bit more streamlined, and yet we appreciate any comments to help improve it even further.
Well, we are already getting people asking us as a trainer of record, when will we start teaching on the new permit? Can we start teaching on the new permit? Now, I don't think it's that simple. What needs to happen in order to get us trainer of records ready to teach on the new permit?
So when it comes to the QSD, QSP training, that is something that the construction general permit training team is kind of tasked with addressing. And that's a combination of both regulators and the regulated community, as well as other qualified stormwater practitioners who are more likely than not trainers of record themselves. And so our current thinking from the training team is that existing QSDs and QSPs will go through what we call a 2022 CGP reissuance review that touches over the major topics that are included in the new permit. And so our intent is to provide a series of standalone modules and learning assessments or quizzes that QSDs and QSPs can access at their leisure, although it would likely be incorporated as part of a recertification process. So if you think to your current QSD and QSP certification process and renewals, every 2 years or so, we'll release a CGP review, and that highlights some areas that regulators would like QSDs and QSPs to focus on based on what they're observing in the field. And so this is kind of built on that framework, and we're looking to just focus on the new requirements and specifically the changes between the permits, because both permits are technically going to be in effect for that 2-year regulatory transition period. Which
in some cases, the information is quite contrary, especially like the definition of a qualifying rain event or precipitation event.
Yes.
When monitoring needs to occur. It's very different now. And so I think it will be confusing to some students to have to learn both permits, but in reality, that's what they're going to need to do in the field or in real practice.
Right. And especially for those new students too, that may not be even familiar with the previous permit, and it's going to get a little bit confusing when learning both. And so you had mentioned, John, that where do the trainers of records kind of fall into this? And for that 2022 CGP reissuance review, we plan on we as in the CGP training team plan to host a feedback forum for trainers of record to get their input on the content and the overall deployment of that reissuance review. And in my opinion, for existing QSDs and QSPs, trainers of record will likely not need to host classes since there is the self-led reissuance review available. But for new QSDs and QSPs, they're essentially going to have to learn both requirements from the 2009 and 2022 CGP. Our thinking here is that the QSD, QSP candidate may take something like a pre-trainer of record course assignment. So they would review through some of the major topics of the 2022 CGP. And then once they take their 2 or 3 day course with their trainer of record, there will be part of the curriculum that that focuses on that pre-course assignment. And that way they can ask and have that face time with the trainers of record to kind of clarify any points that may have been confusing. So we think that that interaction is going to be very helpful in providing the clarity and to kind of delineate or separate out the 2009 and 2022 requirements.
Okay, so a little bit of a pre-class to the class.
Exactly. And maybe not even a class, it was just kind of like an assignment to get familiar with the permit. And in general, it's kind of our standpoint that candidates for their QSDs and QSPs, that they do review whatever permit that they are trying to be a qualified stormwater professional for before they take their class. That way they have some sort of basis of their requirements.
Now you mentioned that existing QSPs, QSDs will have to review something, maybe a publication like you've done before. Will there be an exam with that? And are they going to need to pass at a certain percentage?
Yeah, we're not entirely sure on the deployment of that yet, but we do plan on having a learning assessment or a quiz, not necessarily an exam. And our current thought process is that each of the major topics of the new permit will be broken out into individual modules. And our plan is to actually not necessarily have a publication, but to have a written publication, but to have a recorded training module where we have stormwater professionals kind of run through the topic, and then at the end of that recording, somehow incorporating some quizzes. And I think something that's been discussed is that we kind of want to require a 100% pass rate, but as many tries as you want, and you can do that. And not necessarily making the individual have to go through the entire recording again, but just take the quiz again and have the quiz provide responses as to why the answer they may have selected was wrong.
After all, the point is to just know and learn the information.
Exactly.
Okay,
So
I like it.
Yeah. And then as far as, down the line, when the regulatory transition periods ends, the training team is planning on developing a new curriculum for trainers of record that's based solely on the 2022 permit. And then they'll start teaching that to the new QSDs and QSPs at that point.
Okay. All right. And we should underscore that all of this is definitely in flux right now.
Yes.
It's things that are being discussed. Now, if people have comments or would like to maybe give suggestions on how this should happen, I'm sure they can send you an email or contact you, and we'll have your contact information up on the screen at the end of the workshop today. Speaking of training, the proposed permit opens a new opportunity to what's often referred to as the underlying certification, the CPASC, the PE, the PG. There's a new opportunity. Could you please tell us a little bit about what the water boards may be hoping to see come out of this new feature of the permit?
Mm-hmm. So you're absolutely right. And I can actually kind of consider this a pretty exciting feature of the new permit. So basically, there's a provision that anyone can recommend a course to the state water board for consideration as a QSD or QSP prerequisite. And then water board staff such as myself will review the course and consider criteria that are established by the stormwater professionals with the training team before making a recommendation to our deputy director of the Division of Water Quality at the State Water Board to accept that course as a qualified prerequisite. And so the training team is particularly interested in courses that focus on the fundamentals of stormwater management at construction sites, such as basic monitoring procedures, proper erosion and sediment control. And in doing so, the QSP training program can focus or concentrate on orienting the candidate to the specific requirements of the construction stormwater general permit. So what we're looking for those prerequisite courses to do is to prepare them and have them have a sound foundation of stormwater management as a whole before kind of tweaking that towards the requirements of the permit.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
so, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was going to say, so what we're really hoping to see is kind of compared to the current permit where the prerequisites were directly listed in the permit itself, and ended up being kind of limiting because some of those options dropped off the map. So what we're hoping to see here is kind of an expansion of opportunities for individuals to pursue a career as a stormwater professional, and provide kind of the flexibility and kind of like a more open market for aspiring QSDs and QSPs.
Right. I often get asked a question as a trainer of record, why the two different trainings? Why do they have to go through a 2 or 3 day QSP QSD class and then have an underlying certification? And I tell people it's a lot like the state contractor's licensing. You know, years and years ago, I got my B license, and you know, I went to contractor's school to learn and study for the exam, and I was shocked to find it had nothing to do with about building homes. It was all about the law and about contracting, you know, the process of paperwork contracting. And I tell folks that it's the same way in the stormwater industry. The 3 day, 2 day QSP, QSD class is really about the permit. The underlying certifications about the trade, you know, building houses, or in the stormwater world, erosion sediment control. So
exactly.
Yeah. Sad to say, as I got my contractor's license, still don't know how to build a house. That's why I went in the stormwater field. All right. Well, Brandon, so let's talk about some of the big areas of change in this permit. And let's start with inspections and monitoring. There were some very significant changes with that. There's new definitions, there's new triggers, there's even new changes in roles of what QSPs and QSDs do. Could you walk us through some of those changes?
Of course. The 2022 CGP kind of includes a new definition for the qualifying precipitation event. So instead of a qualifying rain event, we're calling it precipitation now. And that is any weather pattern that is forecasted to have 50% or greater chance of half an inch or more within a 24-hour period. The event begins with the 24-hour period where it was forecasted to have that half inch, and then it continues for each subsequent 24-hour period where there's a quarter inch or more in the forecast.
Yeah, I was joking in one of my newsletters that the real loser in this permit was the rain gauge. It lost its job, or at least its significance. Now everything is forecast based.
That's true. Although rain gauges do kind of make a little comeback with one of our change sheets. And that's we'll talk about that in just a second. So this new definition, as you said, kind of shifts in inspection and monitoring triggers away from accumulations and towards the forecast, as technology has improved significantly and they're more accurate than before. And we kind of we did this shift to improve the inspector's ability to schedule, they may have multiple sites, to schedule their monitoring responsibilities, and it provides more flexibility. The new permit also increases the amount of time that inspectors have for their pre and post inspection. So QSPs are required to conduct a pre-event inspection within 72 hours prior to the qualifying precipitation event's start. But it also may be up to 120 hours in advance of the extended forecast, or in advance of the start of the qualifying precipitation event, if there's a forecast that provides a pretty accurate reading, 6 days out or so. And so with the incorporation of change sheet number 2 into the adopted permit, post-event inspections are actually still triggered based on the amount of precipitation accumulated during the qualifying precipitation event. So that means we can still leave our rain gauges out there and use those to actually calculate, instead of a daily amount, to calculate the amount of rain that occurred over the entire duration of the qualifying precipitation event. And if there was at least half an inch or more of the precipitation, then a post-event inspection is required to be performed in 96 hours, or within 96 hours.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Do you go ahead. Do you have a slide you were going to show?
I do. And so you did mention that the 2022 CGP does require that QSDs and QSPs perform certain inspections. And so I'm going to try and pull up a graphic here from, let's see, where'd it go? From one of my previous workshops where I'm limited with how many screens I have open right now, but so it'll take me a moment to pull this up. Let's see, where's Zoom? Okay, share screen, and we'll share the screen. It's the wrong slide though. Here we go. Okay, is that coming up okay, or is it?
Yeah, here it comes.
Okay. So on this screen here, we have 3 different columns: the qualified SWIP developer, the qualified SWIP practitioner, and then a category that is non-qualified but the trained delegate. And so what we have here on the far left column is the types of inspections that this permit will require. So the first 4 or so are kind of just your general inspections. There's the weekly inspection, there's the pre-precipitation event inspection, the during precipitation event inspection, and the post-precipitation event inspection. What this shows here in these first 4 rows is that pretty much everyone can do all of these inspections, except the trained delegates are not allowed to do the pre-precipitation event inspection. We actually want the qualified SWIP practitioner to be doing that, so that they can identify issues and kind of use their keen eye to prepare in advance of a stormwater or of a qualifying precipitation event. And then there are also various inspections related to what we'll talk about a little bit later, is probably the inactive projects, which is a new change that we're incorporating into the permit. And so that will require that a qualified SWIP developer prepare a change of information to switch to that status. And as part of that, they're going to want to, or we're going to require the QSD to come back 14 days after that change of information is approved, and confirm that those changes are being implemented correctly. And we also want qualified SWIP developers to pay some periodic attention to sites. A lot of times during the current implementation of the permit, the QSD is kind of hands off. They prepare their SWIP, and then everything else kind of just goes into the hands of the QSP. And we want there to be a little bit more communication between there. So they'll be inspecting twice annually, and then prior to the notice of termination submittal. And then as well as if there has been an exceedance of a numeric action level or numeric effluent limitation. That way they can see if there's a room for corrective actions to be made. And then likewise, oh, go
A
ahead.
little more accountability then between the QSP and QSD.
Exactly.
More communication.
Exactly. And so the QSPs will also be required to kind of respond to an exceedance in that way. So ideally what we were hoping for is the QSD and QSP to kind of maybe walk the site together. But we know scheduling is always kind of a challenge here. And so within that 14 days, they can perhaps, walk separately and then kind of schedule a meeting together. And then QSPs will also, they're just pretty much required for the pre-precipitation. They can do all the other inspections as well, except for the specific QSD ones. That's pretty much where we're at there.
Okay. And people will notice that on this list, something is missing that was typically a part of a monitoring program. That's REAPs.
That is correct. Yeah.
They're no longer there.
And
go ahead.
I was going to say that's kind of actually kind of the point of the whole pre-precipitation event inspection being under the QSP's eyes. We thought the REAPs were kind of more of a writing exercise in a sense, and we preferred that they get out onto the field and make their observations and then perform their corrective actions prior to the precipitation event.
And like a REAP, that's one thing that the delegated person cannot do. So it has to be done by that QSP. That way you get the boots on the ground, the professional. But a lot of the REAP requirements are now just embodied into that pre-precipitation event. We're still looking for the same types of things and still wanting to communicate action items to those who are responsible for taking the action.
Yep, exactly.
All right.
Okay, I'll go ahead and stop sharing my
screen.
Good.
So also what we do or how we handle our monitoring data changed a bit in this permit too. NALs, for example, they're still the same, 6.5 and 8.5 and 250 for turbidity, but it's no longer a site-wide average. What do we do with our data now?
That's correct. So we have kind of removed the site-wide average. Instead, we're asking dischargers to collect one sample per discharge location per day. And so that kind of removes the ability to do an average. And the reason why we moved away from a site-wide average is because we saw that, certain discharge locations may be discharging more turbid water or higher pH water or lower pH, just non-neutral water, I guess you could say. Whereas other discharge locations might be fine, but if they are averaging, you kind of lose track of that one with really high or exceeding values. And so that's why we were focusing on just discharge locations for the averaging. And originally we had 3 samples per day per discharge location. But we heard from some commenters during a board hearing that would be excessive for sites with many discharge locations. And so we decided to just leave it at 1. And that kind of provides flexibility for dischargers to say, they may walk upon a discharge location and see that it is turbid, and then maybe be able to go implement some corrective actions before taking their sample. And that would be helpful.
Now, can I still at that one location take corrective action and continue to monitor and average that particular location? Or is it a single, if I had, let's say, 350 NTU when I started monitoring, and that's my high, I did take corrective action, lowered it, but am I stuck with that 350 for that day? Is that the piece of data I'm reporting?
Based on how I read the permit requirements, yes, it only says 1 sample should be reported, and it should be the first sample, I would say. And so you are kind of stuck with that. But that's an area where I'll be taking a look at when we're preparing guidance to make sure our intent's clear with that.
Okay.
Mhm.
All right. Yeah. No, there's a lot of things to digest. You know, I've been looking at this. I think we did a 5-part newsletter series on the permit,
Mhm.
and I'm still finding things. I wonder how that's going to work, and having trying to figure out how are we going to implement that in the field.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's going to take us a while. It's good we have 2 years to kind of digest it and
Right.
work on it. Let's talk about another big change in this. We only have limited time. I know you have workshops that you've given like 4 hours or something.
Yeah.
We got only an hour here. Let's talk about another big area, and that's TMDLs.
Mhm.
Now, for some areas of the state, they're not going to feel any change whatsoever. But there's going to be other areas in the state the change is going to be significant.
Mhm.
Could you walk us through? I know you spent like 45 minutes just talking about TMDLs in one of the last workshops, but give us a quick overview of how that's going to work in this permit.
Okay. Yeah. So TMDLs probably represent the most significant change that was made throughout the reissuance. And they affect discharges or dischargers in watersheds where TMDLs determined that construction stormwater dischargers were were a source of the pollutant that's listed in the TMDL. So this is kind of how I envision the TMDL implementation working. So first, the qualified SWIP developer who is preparing the SWIP for the site will determine whether or not the discharger is a responsible discharger by asking the following questions. Does this project discharge to a TMDL listed watershed or water body? And does this project have the potential to discharge the pollutant that the TMDL addresses? If the answer is no to either of those, the discharger is not a responsible discharger and doesn't have to comply with TMDL implementation requirements. The State Water Board intends to provide a tool similar to the industrial general permit that will help aid the QSDs in determining whether a project is located in the TMDL watershed. The QSDs will have to also be thorough in their pollutant source assessment to determine if that site has the potential to discharge the TMDL specific pollutant. If the answer is actually yes to both questions, then they are a responsible discharger and will have to comply with the applicable requirements in attachment H of the permit, which are there's several categories of TMDL implementation requirements, and they'll be identified in the table in attachment H. So the first is compliance with the general permit, where that's already sufficient to address the pollutant of concern. The second would be erosion and sediment control paired with Russell II or sediment loss modeling for pollutants that are associated with sediment or where a mass-based waste oil allocation was assigned. And then the third and fourth are numeric action levels and numeric effluent limitations. Both numeric action levels and effluent limitations will be assessed through what's called non-visible pollutant monitoring, which is an existing requirement. And they'll do that instead of like the routine stormwater grab samples. So this means that samples for TMDLs are only required if there is a failure to implement best management practices, a container spill or leak, or a breach, failure, or malfunction of a best management practice that may result in the TMDL specific pollutant being discharged off the site. If that BMP issue or that spill or leak is addressed prior to discharge, then non-visible pollutant monitoring is not required. And then when it comes to the numeric action levels and numeric effluent limitations for TMDLs, an exceedance occurs when there are 2 or more analytical results above that numeric action level or effluent limitation for a given drainage area, not discharge location, during a given reporting year. So exceedances trigger corrective actions and iterative best management practice implementation, and the numeric effluent limitation also incurs mandatory minimum penalties per the water code.
Okay, so this is all stuff you can look up ahead of time.
Mm-hmm.
If you know where your project's going to be located, then you need to go to attachment H and see if it's going to apply to you or not.
Mm-hmm.
And it could have a significant impact on your project's budget. You're going to really want to pay attention to this before the SWIP's written, before the budget is set. You're going to want to look at this.
Yeah, particularly if you're in Southern California, so the Los Angeles region, the Riverside and Santa Ana region, and as well as San Diego. A majority of the state actually does not have a TMDL that identifies construction stormwater dischargers. One other area that may impact budgets would be the North Coast region as well, where there's some pretty strict sediment wastewater allocations out there. And so but those mostly rely on using sound, erosion, and sediment control, as well as the sediment loss modeling to kind of demonstrate that you're complying with those.
Okay. And like we said, there's a lot that can be said, should be said about this subject. You're going to want to take advantage of other tools. There's been workshops that are recorded on the State Water Board's website where you go much more in depth in this topic that I'm sure folks today could listen to. Also, read the permit yourself. Take a look at attachment H. Really study that because this is something very new to this permit, and it's going to take that time, these 2 years to really get your arms around it. And will this change over time? I understand that kind of the nature of TMDLs is that they may change, they may reach attainment. Could we expect to see changes in this permit from time to time?
Not without an amendment or a reopening, or just a flat out reissuance.
Okay.
So that will be kind of pressure on state staff to make sure that we incorporate those changes, or pressure on state staff to kind of incorporate those changes on a more frequent basis instead of, the previous permit lasted over 10 years and the normal permit cycle is 5.
Okay.
And so we're really going to be pressured if, TMDL start getting removed to make those changes in a timely manner.
All right. In fact, someone just mentioned, is there a water board link? Is there a place that someone can go to find out what's going on with TMDLs?
Usually it's kind of at the regional water board level. And so if you're interested in your area, I'd visit the, say for Los Angeles, go to the Los Angeles Regional Water Board, and they should have a list of various programs within the region that will provide updates.
Right.
And total maximum daily loads, they go through a separate public process than this permit does. And so that is an opportunity for dischargers and the regulated community to provide input on the TMDL. For instance, some of these TMDLs that are incorporated into the 2022 permit, we really don't see construction being a source, but the TMDL writers at the time did. And so we're kind of bound by what was written there and had to incorporate implementation requirements.
All right. Well, just to remind our viewers, we are going to take a Q&A time. So we'll reserve a few moments at the end of this class. So if you have questions, we have a few in the chat right now, but if you have some now would be a great time to put them in. Let's talk about another subject, Brandon, and you and I were kind of joking about it. You were saying, I don't know why you were so surprised about it. The dewatering hit me as a surprise. It really did. Now, I knew dewatering had been in the permit all along, but maybe it was just my erroneous thinking. But I can't help but think many others had the idea that dewatering was always groundwater. It was just groundwater. But in this permit, and maybe it was just my misunderstanding, in this permit, it makes it clear that it's also stormwater. It's any water, stormwater or groundwater, that gets caught in a low spot. That could be a trench. It could be a pond even. It could be just a depression. And if you're mechanically pumping that off, and maybe you can help us identify what mechanical means, there's going to be some new requirements. Walk us through this real quickly. What's new in this permit and what's now expected?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, if there's any accumulated water on the site that needs to be pumped off, so by mechanical, we're just saying primarily just pumps, that there are dewatering requirements in the permit. However, this was kind of an incorporation into the permit to kind of cover bases statewide. So many regions right now currently have either a separate NPDES permit that regulates discharges, dewatering discharges, or they have what's called a low threat discharge permit. And oftentimes the regional water boards will kind of determine what's the most appropriate permit in that case. But if a region doesn't have that one of those existing permits to address these discharges, that's where the new requirements in this 2022 CGP come into play.
And I did some research. I believe Region 2 is the only one, San Francisco Bay.
I want to say maybe Region 4 and Region 8 have them as well, but I would have to double check. And one of our tasks during this pre-implementation stage is to identify what the existing permits are and then post those on our construction stormwater program webpage to make sure that dischargers know they are complying with the right ones. However, something that's kind of an interesting add-on into the dewatering requirements is that there's a statement that says the regional water boards can just modify this and say, or they can take these dewatering requirements because they might be less stringent than theirs, but more appropriate for construction sites. And so they can adapt these in an instance if they see it more fit, and then maybe change it if they need to a little bit. But the requirements are pretty straightforward. The discharger has to monitor the discharge within the first hour, and then daily if it's a continued dewatering discharge. And they would just be comparing those to the applicable numeric action levels or numeric effluent limitations if they're in a TMDL watershed. But primarily for most of the state, it's going to be the standard pH and turbidity numeric action levels. If they observe that numeric action level is being exceeded, the discharger has to cease their dewatering operation until corrective actions can be made.
I believe there were some specific BMPs as well, such as the use of a skimmer or skimming device.
Yes, taking the water from the surface of, say, if you're dewatering a basin, taking water from the surface because that's less. There's supposed to be less solids up there, and then I want to say there are also requirements for the outlet structure. So if you're dewatering and you're pumping, we want to make sure that water is the energy from that water is being diffused, so it's not causing erosion downstream.
Right. Yeah. Velocity dissipation.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. So which attachment can they find these requirements in?
Attachment J. So it's the final attachment.
All right. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, we do have a few questions. I still have a couple, but let's field some of these. And if you have questions, definitely bring that, put it into the chat. Okay. First one, going back to when we were talking about programmatic permitting. Could that also be for like a meadow restoration project? Someone asked.
That's a good question. Typically, meadow restoration projects are not considered linear underground or overhead projects. So I'm inclined to say no, but it's something that we can kind of field in a discussion offline.
Yeah. Yeah, the idea is really LUPs.
Yes.
So I guess if you have an LUP going through that, but that would typically not be a meadow restoration project. Okay, when will the final adopted version of the 2022 CGP be made available? And a number. When will we have a number?
Yes. So we're hoping to get all of that processed in the next couple of weeks. There are some internal processes with the clerk to the board and some internal reviews that have to be done before we can publish that. But we're hoping to post that soon. And then we're also hoping to kind of redesign our CGP program page, just because now we're going to have 2 permits that are kind of the focus instead of just one, and then kind of active things going on. So stay tuned.
Right. All right, a question here is asked about that transition period. So if a project cannot complete their project by August 2025 under the 2009 permit and needs to obtain coverage under the 2022 permit, how is risk determination analysis handled? That's a good question.
That is a good question.
Which date? I think what we're talking about is what starting date do we use?
I'm inclined to say the starting date of the original when ground was broken. And so that would be still what happened under the 2009 permit. That's my inclination at this point. But that's something that I kind of need to work out with my colleagues. I think that's a great question.
Right. Could make the
Mhm.
difference of whether you're risk level 2 or risk
Yeah.
level 3.
I mean, and we might exactly, and it might do that. And then we might also say, oh, well, we can start it with the, September 1st, and that will give maybe some additional relief to the discharger because they're transitioning to newer requirements. And so maybe if they use September 1st, then it would be a lower risk and therefore a little bit more relief. So.
Mhm, mhm. Someone here asked a question, does the State Water Board have data that confirms there's enough QSPs, QSDs in the industry to implement the inspection requirements? Is there any recruiting efforts being made by the board to bring in QSP, QSDs? So
Um,
I imagine that's also a CGPTT question.
Yeah, I mean, and that kind of goes in line with some of the new provisions that we included to increase prerequisite courses. And one of the new prerequisites we actually incorporated was a 4-year construction management degree, I believe. And so that opens an opportunity for a lot of new college graduates to also seek employment as a qualified stormwater professional. But at this time, I haven't done any specific analysis on whether the number of available QSDs and QSPs is capable of assisting compliance for the new permit. I have heard that there are concerns that there aren't enough, but yeah.
Okay. Here's a question. Let me see. Is the TMDL component really the only aspect of the permit that has the project analyze the possible pollutants that may be discharged prior to the project receiving the permit? Or is an exercise the project has to do even if there is no TMDL? I guess that's a good question, and I think it's kind of like the IGP where you have to do a pollutant assessment.
Mhm.
Well, what's your thoughts on that, Brandon?
Yeah, I mean, the current permit, the 2009 permit, also requires pollutant source assessments because it also does have the non-visible pollutant source, non-visible pollutant monitoring. Um, so I would say no, all dischargers have to do pollutant source assessments. But the requirements for the TMDL implementation, because part of that pollutant source assessment is determining whether there's actually pollutants on the site or not. And since the TMDLs are specific to certain pollutants, if they determine that there isn't that pollutant on site and they don't have the potential to discharge it, we didn't see the need to make them comply with implementation requirements. So that's where it kind of ties in, but all sites should be doing pollutant source assessments.
Right. It's actually a part of writing the SWIP. It's
Yes.
identifying those activities, those subcontractors and construction activities that are going on.
Yep. And
Okay.
it kind of determines what BMPs you might use. So
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Here's a question about common plan of development. A city construction activity that involves the need for CGP coverage and a contractor performing construction in the city and state property. So I guess that's the context. In addition to the city, does the state and the contractor need CGP coverage in SMARTS to issue the state encroachment permit for the portion of the construction activity in the state property? So this is being asked by someone from Caltrans.
okay. That's probably a question that we could better answer via email correspondence to the Stormwater Help Desk.
Okay.
Mhm.
All right. All right, here's one about the permits rain trigger. So the permits rain trigger has two separate components: a POP, or a precipitation percentage greater or equal to 50%, and a qualifying precipitation frequency? No, forecast. See, I'm learning these acronyms too. A qualifying precipitation forecast greater than equal to 0.5 inches. So it's two components that work together, which is different than the 50% probability of greater than equal to a half inch of rain. Can you clarify that? And Jeff, if you want to unmute yourself, maybe I slaughtered that question. You can go ahead and ask that if you'd like, or clarify what I was just asking. Jeff, you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, there you go. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we
Yep.
can.
Yeah, this is Jeff. Hi, Brandon.
Hey,
Yeah,
Jeff.
the question for clarification is, I think earlier it was mentioned that it's a 50% probability of a half-inch of rain, which that's not exactly what the permit says. What the permit says is you need two things to have a qualifying precipitation event. The first is a probability of precipitation, a POP of 50% or greater, and you need a quantified precipitation forecast, a QPF, of greater than a half inch. The problem with mixing POPs with QPFs is a POP only gives you the probability of precipitation of at least 0.1 inches of precipitation somewhere in the forecast area. It doesn't really tell you whether you're going to get a half inch or not. So I just wanted to clarify if I was reading the permit correctly or if something else was intended.
I think you're reading it correctly in the sense that yes, we need both of those criteria to kind of qualify it as or make it a qualifying precipitation event. So the way I'm reading it is, yes, it would still have to have a 50% greater chance of 0.5 inches or more in a 24-hour period. And so Jeff, do you think there's an issue with pulling the percentage and then having the intensity over that 24-hour period from, maybe different forecasts? Or
no, I don't. Actually, I think this is a great improvement over the last permit. This one is forecast based. It's easy information to obtain, and I really think it's the way to go as long as everyone's on the same page what the two different factors really mean. So I think this is a great improvement.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Jeff. And then just for those out there, Jeff is also part of the construction general permit training team. And so it's kind of one of our responsibilities to make sure that we are clear on what the intent is and what these two terms mean and how they play into the qualifying precipitation event.
Okay.
Thank you, Jeff.
Good. I think we still have a couple more minutes here. So let's see if we can get another one or two questions in. Is analytical monitoring, pH and turbidity, required for dewatering discharges for risk level 1 sites?
Yes.
Good question. So yeah, typically it's not, but in this case it will be. All right, and let's see. If here's one about, again, the transition. If a project starts prior to the effective date in 2023, but is scheduled to end August 2025, this means the project could remain under the 2009 permit requirements, right?
That is correct.
All right. And then will non-visible monitoring requirements be required to be noted on the erosion control plans that are submitted with rough grading plans and or precise grading plans?
So like their procedures for non-visible pollutant monitoring, is that?
Yeah. I think maybe that might be something that we see Caltrans typically require.
Okay.
But I don't think there's a CGP requirement to do that.
I mean, we do require in general a kind of a monitoring program in as part of the SWIP, right? And so I put that in there, just kind of as a general procedure.
But it doesn't get specific as far as where it needs to be in. It just needs to be in the SWIP.
Yeah.
Okay, great, good. Yeah, we're just about out of time, so I want to thank you, Brandon, for being a part of this. In fact, let me bring up my share screen so I can give your information, your contact information to everybody. So let me share that real quick here. So if you would like to get a hold of Brandon, here's his email. Also, the website to the stormwater construction program. Check that out. There's new information being added there all the time. And as you heard Brandon, they're going to be reworking that soon. So yeah, definitely get there. Also, if you would like a copy of the newsletter we've written summarizing the changes in the permit, along with the change sheets. We've included that. Go to the stormwaterawareness.org website, go to the menu, click on resources, and there'll be another button to download presentations. And I have that linked under today's presentation, so you can download that as well as the change sheets. Of course, you can get that also from the State Water Board's website. So, all right, well, thank you for participating in today's class. There's a lot of other classes happening, and take advantage of this week of free education. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Brandon, for being a part of this.
Oh, always happy to. And take care, everyone.
All right.